Everything is about to collapse in e-commerce, and I'm going to give you the reasons why I believe that's true on this episode of my podcast. I'm going to tell you at least 7 reasons why I think things could go really wrong in 2025 for e-commerce and tell you what you should do to make sure it doesn't happen to your business. Let's jump into it. All right, I'm going to tell you up front that this is a difficult exercise for me to do. I recently recorded an episode called The Bull Case for E-commerce. I was challenged on X to doing a follow-up episode where I did the bear case for e-commerce. The truth is, if you go look at that bull case episode, the bull case for e-commerce in 2025, you will see in that episode that I am optimistic about where e-commerce is going. So I'm going to tell you up front that I'm doing that. But I also think it is the job. When I used to be a CEO of an aggregator, 4x400, I remember one of the things I was talking to some smart folks in our space about was that one of the jobs of a CEO is to look around the corner and see what could be coming and to be a little bit pessimistic. That's a hard instinct for me. I tend to be a pretty optimistic guy, but I do think it's a good instinct. I think it's a good practice to think like, what could really go wrong in this space? And so with some help from a couple others and with some thinking of my own, I've come to think of like what I think could create real problems in the e-commerce space in 2025, but maybe even beyond that in 2025. Some of these will have a little bit of a longer timeline than that. So I'm going to give you my answers to that question, how e-commerce can go wrong in 2025. And I'm going to start with number 1. I've got 7 of them right now. I'm going to start with number 1, which is the most obvious one, which is tariffs, offshoring, and U.S. isolationism in general. President Trump, since he's been elected, has already threatened, actually kind of promised, I'm not sure, a 25% tariff on all Canadian and Mexican goods coming into the U.S. And whether or not that actually happens is a fair question. Right now on Polymarket, as I record this, which I think is actually a really good way to get your head around this, Polymarket says there's a 37% chance, or there's a 37% yes reading on the idea that there would be a tariff from Mexico to Mexico and Canada. He threatened similar things during his first presidency. So who knows if that happens? A major tariff to China, of course, is an even bigger deal for a lot of people. And generally, shaky relationships with China and all that, considering how much manufacturing still happens there and how much manufacturing has been a target of the administration, as they've voiced it, are all concerns. And listen, you don't need to get exactly into whether or not there are going to be tariffs that are going to make it harder to do business in the US with international folks to recognize that this is a real possibility in some way. Like whatever the precise number is, it is definitely, in my view, the most obvious way that margins get squeezed in the immediate future for US-based e-commerce businesses. This is a number 1, okay? That's tariffs and U.S. isolationism in general create difficulties for doing this. And you could actually take this another level to the offshoring issue, offshoring of talent, where you could imagine some kind of setup in some way that makes this harder to do for US-based companies. I have a sponsor called More Staffing that I absolutely love. I mention them all the time. They staff teams in the Philippines for US-based e-commerce businesses. They've got multiple sort of sub companies within that do supply chain work and design and video editing work. I work with them across every part of my business that I touch. I really love them. It would be a real problem for me and my business if there was somehow, some way, a difficulty in hiring overseas talent in the US because of some kind of regulation that was trying to keep more jobs in the US. Now, forget anything you think ethically about any of those things for just a second, right? Let's just talk in terms of purely capitalistic economics about that. And I think that's the number 1 way this could be a real problem. And so Chinese manufacturing is the most obvious target of this. But again, Mexico and Canada also could be hit in various ways for people doing business in those places. And that could really create problems. I mean, if you already are a brand that is lower margin, getting squeezed additionally from those manufacturers with tariffs would create a real problem for some businesses and make it really, really hard to grow. There could also be some ripple effects here economically, and this is going to get into something I'm going to bring up later, which is the macroeconomic outcomes of some of these policies. But you could sort of also imagine, like, I mean, I'm actually working on a new brand right now, and there was a possibility that I was going to work with a Canadian manufacturer. It's still a possibility, actually. And I immediately went to my unit economics sheet as I was prepping for that brand, and I thought, what happens if my manufacturing costs of my product costs go up by 25%? And you know what I did immediately when that happened? I immediately went and changed my AOV up. I told myself, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to raise the price. Now, this is, of course, the fundamental economics argument against tariffs, is that all it does is pass costs along to consumers. I am not a good enough economist to know how much that is true in the short and long term and what the downstream and second order and third order consequences are of all of these things. But I just know that was my immediate instinct, was like, I'll just pass the cost on to the customer. And then I thought about how that would probably constrict my growth because it would make it so my product was a little less accessible and some of those things. I think that could also be a thing here where suddenly everything gets a little more expensive and it gets a little more competitive and it just restricts growth all the way across the board. To me, that's sort of, again, the most obvious way that things get a lot harder really fast for brands that already run. A lot of times in e-commerce brands, a 10% net profit is pretty good, especially for a growing business. And so you could really imagine a couple points of profit being eaten away pretty quick, and maybe more than that, again, depending on how large of a part of your total cost COGS are, to where that to me is something that's really challenging. So what do you do about that? I think probably what I would do right now is watch carefully. I would get out in front of tariff regulations as much as I could, understand the space as well as I possibly could. If I was starting that business, just thinking through like, what this is going to be, I would start modeling out costs, modeling out solutions immediately. Do I just eat it on this? Are my COGS low enough to where this is not really a huge problem for me? Do I think about raising the price if I do that? Kind of begin to get your head around what those possibilities are. I think it's not obvious what the solution is. And if it's a cost increase, it just is a cost increase. The other thing I would think about right away is starting to look around, honestly, at additional suppliers. Like if you don't need to be manufacturing in China, maybe you can look around at other places. I'm going to give you another reason why I think manufacturing in China could be a problem. Yeah, it's always a good idea and a good practice to be shopping your supply chain. I mentioned Move Supply Chain a minute ago, a sister company of More Staffing. This is what they do. And I really do believe that even regardless of whether or not tariffs happen, most brands in our space have under-optimized supply chains, and that you ought to go and think about investing in talking to more manufacturers, think about how to get your costs down, really shopping that aggressively and getting on top of that part of your business. So many brands are started by product people and marketing people who want to grow businesses. They're not really supply chain people who understand the details of these supply chains. And it's where I think it could really, really help to get some help from somebody like Move, who can do a project basis where they can actually help introduce you to additional suppliers, and think about how to shop those things, get better rates, et cetera. Start doing it aggressively now so that you create a little more margin room, more favorable terms, all those things that can make it a little bit easier and better to run your business. So that's number one: tariffs, onshoring or offshoring, and US isolationism. Okay, number two, this is a little bit of a bigger swing, a little bit of a wider one, but population decline, particularly in China. Population decline is a story all over the world, and is a real issue. It's a real issue, and I'm really curious to see how this reshapes the world in a lot of ways. The last I had seen is that Chinese population decline. We're way down from the one child policy here, of course, right? But in China in particular, people are manufacturing a lot. China, the population is already declining. It has dropped by 2 million people in 2023, and it will continue to speed up the trend over more time. The projected population would theoretically get as low in the year 2100, it's a little ways out, as 800 million people, down from 1.4 billion now. So is that a problem right now? No. And I'm not talking about building your business for the year 2100. But what I am saying is that it's possible that there are more older people in China in particular, and this is China's one snapshot. This is an issue all over the world, that could make it more difficult in a lot of ways to staff manufacturing jobs across the world, because the fertility rates are very low in the world right now. People are having just way less children than they used to. The extreme example of this is in South Korea, where I believe the total fertility rate is like less than one child per two people. That it means that your population is declining extremely quickly. And that's South Korea. I don't think there's a lot of manufacturing happening there these days. But there's a similar thing happening in China. And who knows how this trend will all go. But I could imagine manufacturing jobs becoming more expensive in various parts of the world. That's what I'm saying. When I switched my landing pages to FERMAT for one of the brands that I was working on, we saw an immediate 50% spend increase for our Meta ad spend. That is a huge increase. It is why I first got clued into FERMAT, why I took them as a sponsor on this show, because I was so impressed with the service as it came. As I've said elsewhere, FERMAT is essentially the Ferrari of landing page software. It's actually more than even software. There's an agency service that comes with it. Everything about using FERMAT is guided by agency level help, account managers who walk you through it, who really serve as co-strategists with you on utilizing everything there is with FERMAT. And it really is an incredible piece of software. It is the best landing page software I've ever seen at the level of landing page itself. Extremely fast loading, like ridiculously fast loading software. But the magic goes beyond just the landing page. It's actually much more than that. Beyond the landing page, it's enhanced PDPs, custom to every funnel you want to build. You can even build custom cart flows off the back of those really, really easily, build custom bundles, test everything in their system without using third-party testing software, with clear indications of stat sig whenever you're running your tests, split traffic down at the ad level, at the category level, anything you want to do to make it easy for you to output huge volumes of testing at the level of landing pages, you can do with FERMAT. If you're serious about using post-click marketing optimization, landing pages, PDPs, bundles, anything like that, cart upsells, to increase the value of the ads that you are running, you should be giving FERMAT a serious look. It is by far, and I mean this, the best, most robust software for that sort of thing that I've ever seen. Go to fermatcommerce.com/AF to check it out, fermatcommerce.com/AF to check it out. You will love it. It will be great. It will help you sell more stuff over some time period because it becomes harder to replace labor. Now, at the same time, I could imagine automation coming up and creating a sort of counter move to that, to where automation in factories means that you don't need as much human labor to do these kinds of things. But in the meantime, it's sort of a broader time scope thing that I'm wondering how over the next 10 to 20 years, really, that's going to reshape things. So I won't belabor that point. I don't know how that will all play out. There is also population decline in the US, by the way, not as drastic, but we'll see kind of how some of those trends change over more time. So something to watch out for. The solution to that is the same as it was in the first one, which is to continue to think about just hammering away at optimizing your supply chain. It's a best practice all the way around, and you should consider it. So this is not this is something you should be thinking about all the time in your business, is how to negotiate better manufacturing, better supply chain, etc. Okay, number 3. Let's move to the marketing side, okay? The continuing problem of single channel advertising. I'm gonna talk about Meta specifically in a second, but it just seems like one of the sort of constant existential threats to D2C is that we are so dependent on Meta, and this some notion of single channel advertising in general, that if something goes wrong there, it becomes a single point of failure in the whole industry. I'm going to talk more specifically about Meta, like I said, in just a second, about what I think that dynamic could be there if it happens. But the single point of failure problem more broadly is another issue. I have for a long time been a person who has advocated that you should not, for a long time in your business, diversify your marketing channel mix. Because while there is risk involved with single channel, it seems to me that there is more risk in spending money in places that you don't get a very good return on the money. It's extremely costly to open up new advertising channels. And if you're sub 30 million in revenue, that's sort of a rough number, depends on the business and how you get there, but something like that. In general, being single channel is fine, I think, for most businesses. And so maybe this is really more of a mid-market concern, but even for those mid-market brands, they're still spending the bulk of their revenue on Meta. And so it is still single channel focused, and the ability to open up additional channels of marketing could make a really big difference. And this is where I would say, larger legacy businesses with retail distribution as well are going to have a much easier time, because there are just many more ad channels that are effective for these larger brand plays, larger awareness plays, etc. But when you're performance oriented, and when you're performance oriented with a real single channel investment, the answer here, or the problem here, is really clear, which is that if something breaks with Meta, everything in your business can break. And I've experienced this with brands before. And by something breaks, quote unquote, I mean you get worse at it, or something happens on the Meta side, or whatever it is, right? Like it may not be even Meta's fault. It could be your own fault or something. I've even heard and saw, Cody Plofker tweeting recently something to the effect of Jones Road. The best thing that they did in 2024 was opened up some new advertising channels. But the worst thing they did was they lost focus on Meta as they did that. And that actually made their performance decline there. And they opening up those new channels, therefore created some additional costs. So it was a painful process is what I think Cody was basically implying as he opened up those new channels. And so that is a real existential threat all the time to this business. Now, for the brands that are TikTok shops or something, where that's your single channel, this becomes an even more existential threat in the sense that TikTok perhaps could get shut down. I personally don't think that will happen. I haven't checked Polymarket on that, but it's an interesting idea. I think it seems pretty unlikely to me that TikTok will go away. But just generally speaking, many less people are sort of so leveraged on TikTok specifically. Right now, Polymarket has that at a 33% chance. TikTok banned in the U.S. before May 2025, so that's not nothing. That's a pretty meaningful possibility, and it's actually going up all the time. So who knows? So we could see a challenge there if that's a larger part of your revenue as well. What do you do about that? I actually wouldn't change what I would do here in general. I think on the whole, I would keep investing in Meta. I think this is up until, like I said, 30 million or something in revenue, I would keep going there. I would think about if there are simple ways to do this to curb a little bit of some possibilities. There's a couple things that are compelling to me. I mentioned them in my bull case episode as possible ways that are low cost ways to open up additional channels. And certainly, if any of those are real, you should get on them just to diversify to have it. I think if it's a low enough cost, it maybe is worth doing. I think YouTube Shorts is a little interesting to me right now, something I haven't talked much about. AppLovin is interesting to me right now. It seems like the front runner right now to me as a meaningful channel expansion. I think Amazon is sort of its own version of this, where the Amazon ad and of course sales channel ecosystem creates some hedge here. Although I think that's also really downstream from Meta in its own way. So, but yeah, I actually still think that despite this being a risk, that if you're certainly for sub 10 million, I would just accept this risk at this point. I would just say, yep, that's unfortunately one of the risks in the business. And I would keep trying to hammer Meta unless, again, it is a very low barrier to entry for these other channels. If they are, go for it, get on them. But if they're not, I think it's just not worth pursuing. Number 4, let's talk about Meta specifically, Meta competition specifically. This is if Meta breaks, if Meta becomes a less viable channel for everybody, here's how it will happen. The CPMs will just get too high. Now, I want to say up front, rising CPMs is something I hear people say every year. I have heard it every year for 10 years in e-commerce. I have constantly heard people talk about the problem of rising CPMs in Meta. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of them, for example, that nobody talks about is inflation. Like rising CPMs is a reality because things get more expensive over time. We have a word for that, inflation. That said, I also do think there's a reality where as more and more money floods to the platform, as the barrier to entry lowers for e-commerce, you could imagine the cost of the ads outpacing the ads' ability to deliver value at those costs. Now, the reason I have not worried about this is because every time this has looked like a problem, Meta has solved it. Right. So, for example, in the early days, Meta opened up Instagram on top of Facebook. Okay. Back then they were just called Facebook, and they added Instagram, and there was a new channel. Okay. On top of Instagram, eventually they became Instagram Stories. Once Snapchat Stories became a channel. Once TikTok became a thing, Instagram had Reels, and they will continue to find ways, I believe, to open up additional inventory. They've tried to do Threads. I don't know if anybody's using Threads, but that was like an attempted plan. Like there's just all of these different things like that they have continued to do as trends have changed, as social media has changed to do this. And in fact, if TikTok gets banned, I expect a whole bunch more value and a whole bunch more traffic to happen on Meta, because Instagram Reels will be the very obvious place where people will go if that happens. So there's a possibility that this actually goes the other way. CPMs go down, and there becomes a viable way for this to grow. And this is, again, where I would say, like, I'm happy to do this bear case episode and to think through this and to look around the corner and see what the problem could be. I also think it could be wrong that most of that it's very likely that there are things that go poorly and that there are things that go well, and both of those possibilities are there in the future. So meta competition via CPMS in particular is a real problem where people, or it could be a real problem. I actually don't think it's been a real problem right now. Some people are suggesting that meta has slowed down in value this year. I haven't seen a lot of data to suggest that's necessarily true, though I know I've seen some anecdotal stuff about that. So who knows? Okay, number 5. Let's talk more specifically about Meta, and actually again a broader thing that would apply well beyond Meta. And I think this is actually a more likely existential threat to me, to the business, than anything else. And it is the commoditization of advertising via AI. The commoditization of advertising via AI. What could happen here? I'm starting to see more and more whispers of people whose entire ad output doesn't involve a human. It is just AI reading ads and making more like it, with basically no humans getting involved. And if you can create endless ads at scale that eventually just um, with bulk output, essentially bully the meta ad system into spending until you have winners. I could imagine a world where it becomes so cheap to generate so many ads that you're and you could do the same thing with landing pages and so on, that essentially you everybody gets so good at spending their money, and especially when you layer on manual bids, so that the manual bids allow you to do this basically for free on the distribution side as well, and take as much space as you can, that actually it massively speeds up this CPM competition problem, because ads get so effective so fast that it basically floods money to the platform because of the efficiency, and sort of counterintuitively takes efficiency out of the platform for basically everybody else, because there's just too much money going there. Now, there's still some limitations to how much value you can even drive on Meta, right? At some point, you have to manufacture the product, and you have to plan cash for it or whatever. But there's you could imagine a way in which the game becomes so efficient. There's like a game theory problem here. It becomes so efficient for some people that it actually makes it worse for the whole. And maybe even those people themselves in some way get beat by the same thing, because everybody starts doing sort of an AI arms race with ads, and it just sort of changes the whole game for everyone all the time. Now, if that happens, I'll say again, there's a way in which this could be good. If you are a winner on this, or even if there's a partial version of this, it could just drive your cost per ad down so low that all it does for you is open up more margin. You could also imagine that this is precisely how other channels get opened up, right? And so I think my answer to what do you do about this and the meta competition issue that I mentioned earlier is that you keep investing in great creative processes, including using AI where you can to drive costs down and drive value up for yourself. And that's the answer. And if you can get really good at that, if you can get really good at that kind of focused approach, if you can do that through manual bids, like I talk about all the time, if you can do all those things together, then you also can develop muscles that you could then use for other channels. And suddenly maybe YouTube becomes much more viable for you, because you just get so good at creating so much testing for so cheap that you sort of, again, bully the system into eventually spending for you until it happens. You just create enough total output that you attack it with bulk. Okay, that would be the way I would think about this: is lean right into it as opposed to away from it. So I'm thinking all the time about how to integrate AI better into our processes. I'm not great at it. I'm not. I have a hard time thinking down that way. I don't particularly like it. That's another challenge. And so it's the kind of problem solving involved using AI for creative is just not my favorite kind of problem solving to do. So I have to push through that. But that is, I think, the only way to think about it, is that you have to get good at it, embrace the tool as much as you can, and try to figure out how that fits into your process. So yeah. Okay. Number 6, downstream from the AI issue, I could also imagine something happening here that creates a crisis of trust. This is a much bigger, wider swing. Okay. But essentially what I'm saying is, as AI gets better and better, I could sort of imagine a mass reaction to that from people that decide together to essentially hate everything AI, or to go like, I don't, the humanity would get removed from brands and from people's interactions in ways where you could sort of imagine a a mass reaction that is negative towards this kind of output that would actually kind of turn around and make the whole game harder again. And where you were previously getting margin additions from AI, it could actually hurt you in some other ways. You could even imagine AI detection tools being used that people have on mobile apps or browsers or whatever, where they just sort of reject all ads that are AI, or um, they sort of pre-screen content for AI in some way or another. There's something like that you can imagine. I don't know exactly what it would be, but it's not too hard for me to imagine people who go like, I don't really want that to be the world I live in. I want to embrace the tool, but I don't want an AI avatar talking to me. I don't want endless AI copy talking to me. I want somewhere to be a real human, and for some people to go, we're going to just make this so that it's not as much of a part of that problem. Again, I don't think this is likely, but I could imagine something like that happen. Social movements are hard to predict. I can imagine something like that happening in a way that could create a problem. So how do you head that off? I actually think there's a simple way you do this, which is that you remain authentic in your business as best as possible. You use AI in smart ways to make your processes better, but you don't try to go the full route of complete AI embrace. That would be one way to head this off. For me personally, I also, again, just want to run a business more this way. And if that is what puts me in the e-commerce grave, then so be it. There's some element of this here where I want to maintain some of my own creative approach to these things because I enjoy it, because I find value in the work, etc. And you could also imagine some ways in which a brand could make some claims around their use of AI that appealed if that situation happened. So there's that. Okay. I think that's a little more speculative. That's a little bit like the population decline one, where it's a little harder to say, but that's what I think. Okay, number 7. This is my biggest swing. That is the hardest one. It's actually, in my view, probably the most likely problem. If tariffs and offshoring and isolationism, or tariffs and onshoring and isolationism, are the most obvious specific challenge on the manufacturing supply chain side, if to where you could see a clear cost increase that creates clear problems based on a very clear mechanism. Okay, and if meta competition and sort of single channel reliance is the biggest problem on the marketing side, there's a problem bigger than all of those that goes against directly what I think is the biggest reason that I'm a bull for e-commerce overall, right? And it is macroeconomics. So I said in my bull case episode that the number one reason I believe in the future of e-commerce is that the total share of U.S. retail is going more and more towards e-commerce every year. And 10 years ago, it was about 7% of total U.S. retail was e-commerce. This year, it's going to end around 16 or 17%. So it's a huge growth. That curve is up and to the right. It has shown no signs of slowing down so far. More and more commerce is happening. More and more retail is happening online every single year. Okay. And on top of that, the economy's grown. And so because the economy's grown, it's a larger slice of a larger pie. Okay. So that just means you get more pie. All right. Now, that also is all outside of my control. And so here's the counter argument to that. The counter argument that I see is that there is some macroeconomic decline that happens, right? That suddenly, maybe at some point, there's just some upper limit of how much people want to shop online versus in stores. And so that slows down. Or maybe it's even something more stark. Perhaps to go back to the tariff and offshoring thing, you could imagine that tariffs do have a bunch of knock-on effects that massively slow down the economy. This is certainly the prediction of some economists who are very concerned about isolationist policies relative to global possibilities, that it actually creates a real problem because tariffs slow down the economy and people have less money, and it is a big financial issue for people, right? And they have less money and it hurts jobs and like all those kinds of things. It becomes all of these downstream macroeconomic effects that are real problems. And that's not very hard to imagine, that scenario. Like I said, some economists actually predict almost exactly that. I don't know how wide they think that problem would affect the economy, but certainly some anti-tariff economists are suggesting that is a problem. And so that could really happen. And of course, there's also the same thing I said in the bull case episode on the macroeconomic level, which is unknown unknowns. There could be just some shock to the system that creates a real problem for the US economy that we can't see coming. We don't even know what it is, but that's always a possibility. And this is where I think there's always some wisdom in thinking about how to make your business a little bit more future-proofed in some way. The most obvious version of this is to keep some cash around insofar as it's possible. This is probably one of the best arguments I can think of for taking Taylor Holiday's advice and running your business, growing your business a little slower at a little higher margin and taking more money on first purchase and relying less on LTV. It just makes it so that your business has a little bit more wiggle room in it, so that if something goes wrong, you can absorb it and you can be okay. And you've got some savings for a rainy day if something goes wrong. I think that's a good practice in general. For me, again, I'm not trying to sort of hyperscale anything. And so I've done that even with my agency. Like I've got some money aside where my business is not very cash intensive, but I just don't know what's going to happen. And so I've just got in a high yield savings account, and it's just a possibility all the time that that something could go wrong and that I'm going to need that money. And so I don't know what that is, but just trying to be aware of that. To me, this is always the most obvious bear case, is that something happens that's a shock to the system that none of us can see coming. You think of the housing crisis in 2008. It was very hard to predict, right? There's a few people who they made a movie about and a book about who got it right, but pretty much everybody else got it wrong. And that is the way I would think about the same thing. Who knows what's going on now and what could create that same kind of outcome. So run back through them again really fast. Number one, tariffs and U.S. isolationism in general. Number two, population decline, a little bit of a bigger swing there. Number three, single channel advertising conceptually as a basic problem. Number four, specifically, meta competition, CPMs rising, that kind of thing. Number five, that problem being sped up and with the commoditization of advertising via AI. Number six, a crisis of trust in some way, downstream from AI, downstream from some of those things that creates a change in the way consumers perceive brands. Number seven, macroeconomics, both with particular policies of President Trump and of the new Republican leadership. Again, I'm actually not speculating on any of those specifically. It just could happen, I think. And then unknown unknowns in the macroeconomic world as well. That's my case. Having said all that, like I said, it's not what I think is most likely. I'm bullish. I really am bullish on the total possibilities for D2C, but I do think it's a good practice to think about these things and go, what do I need to do to just make sure I cover the downside case? Hey, thanks for watching, for listening. If you like this episode, I hope you will subscribe wherever you're watching or listening and not miss out. I got a couple great interviews coming up, including folks from Baseball Lifestyle. I'm going to interview them soon. Really big, soon to be a 9-figure brand who are doing monster things. I've also got Aaron Orndorff coming back soon, who's always a good time to talk to. So a bunch more stuff like that. I'm also going to do some 2025 prep. So if you're thinking about like what to do looking into 2025, like how should you be prepping your business, got an episode on that coming soon as well, maybe downstream from this bull and bear case kind of conversation. If you would like to respond to this, I'd love to hear it. If you have more things that could go wrong in D2C, I'd love to hear what you think those are. Please email me at podcast@ajfgrowth.com or reach out to me on X @AndrewJFerris. I would love if you do it publicly there so that other people can weigh in on this same thing. And of course, you can see everything I'm doing at ajfgrowth.com. I'd love for you to sign up for my email list there. I'll send you some e-commerce resources that'll be really helpful to you to run your business as well as you possibly can. Thanks to my sponsors. As always, go support them. They are very helpful, great people whose products and services I really do use. And that's why I say it every time. And I'm so glad to support them. Thanks for watching, for listening. Talk to you next time.